So let's open our Bibles, if we will, to 1 Timothy chapter 6, okay? And I'm going to adjust this microphone, if you will. Just give me a minute. Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 6 is where we are. And if you remember, this is a letter from the Apostle Paul to Timothy. And Timothy is a young minister at the church of Ephesus. And he has mentioned several times about false teachers, if you've been following along with us the last several weeks. And he's going to talk about false teachers again here in chapter 6. As a matter of fact, the first 5 verses of 1 Timothy chapter 6, he talks about false teachers again, but he actually introduces this new topic of materialism. And basically what he says in the first 5 verses, which we're not going to read this morning, he talks about how these false teachers are actually, they're obsessed with money, and they see the Christian faith as a way to make money, to make a buck, okay? And so then we get to the verses that we're actually going to read today, beginning in verse 6, verses 6 to 8, and you're going to probably recognize verse 6, pretty famous verse. He says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." Now, you know, as Christians, we might look at that at verse 6, and we might sort of focus on that word godliness. I think that perhaps is our natural tendencies. You know, as a Christian, we're just programmed to be drawn to that whole idea of being godly, okay? But the goal, notice the goal in verse 6 here is not just to be godly. Godly is a wonderful goal, but is godliness with contentment, together, not apart, but together, it's of great gain. That is the goal. As a matter of fact, if you're keeping notes, that's how I would really sum up what he says here in verses 6 to 8. I'll just take directly from verse 6. That is, godliness with contentment is great gain. There it is. Godliness with contentment is great gain. And again, I think most of us, at least intellectually, we know this. Yeah, as Christians, we should be godly, and yes, as Christians, I really shouldn't be greedy. I shouldn't be materialistic. Maybe the cell phone, if it's only a year old, maybe I can make it limp along for another couple of years. You know, we know that intellectually, but there's a problem. We've already talked about the problem. The problem is we always want newer, fresher, better, faster, and so we have this problem, and the problem is introduced beginning in verse 9, and the problem, of course, is this idea of materialism, not being content. And you're going to recognize another very famous verse in these verses here. He says, "People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Now, verse 10 is, of course, that very famous verse, right? "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And once again, if I were to summarize verses 9 and 10, I can't improve upon those words. And so if you're taking notes, there it is. There's how we would summarize what he says in verses 9 and 10. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. That's our problem. We love money. Even though we're a follower of Jesus, even though we love the Lord, sometimes if we're not content with what we have, we start moving away and we start chasing money. We start chasing things. We start trying to accumulate more and more things. But if we do that, if we cross the line, if we begin to love money, if we cross the line and become materialistic, it's a root of all kinds of evil. And you know, we might think, oh, yeah, there's all kinds of problems if we start to chase money. We know that, we might overextend ourselves, get into debt. We might even have to declare bankruptcy. Maybe we have health problems. I get a heart attack because I'm so stressed out because of all my money problems. But here, those are not significant problems. We think they're problems, but what he's talking about here is all kinds of evil. Some men, some Christians eager for money, they're constantly chasing material things, and they plunge themselves into ruin and destruction. And that word plunge, very interesting word. It describes a ship going to the bottom of the ocean. People who become overly materialistic, if we start chasing money, loving money, we plunge into ruin and destruction. We pierce ourselves with all kinds of grief, he says. And what really jumps off the page for me is that some people, one of the worst problems, one of the worst pitfalls if we become materialistic is we could actually wander from the faith. Now that's a significant problem. And we thought bankruptcy was a problem, or having a heart attack because of our money problem was a problem. But that's nothing compared to wandering from our faith. That's a significant problem. So we know that we are to be content. We know that that's the goal. Godliness with contentment is of great gain, of great value. Again, most of us, we know that intellectually, and I think most of us already were aware that there are some serious problems here with chasing money. So what is the solution? What's the strategy to overcoming our problem? What is the strategy for becoming content? How can we break the power of greed? Well, in the following verses, Paul, the writer, tells Timothy, the preacher there, and we're not going to read these verses, but he tells Timothy what he should do personally as a minister. And then, beginning in verse 17, he actually gives instructions to us, or instructions to Timothy to tell the rest of the congregation. And here's what he says, beginning in verse 17. It says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life."